Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Key to the Pastcast, put on by the Trumbull County Historical Society. My name is Ryan McLennan, and with me
is Megan Reed, also of the Trumbull County Historical Society.
We'd like to shout out our sponsors.
Yes, this podcast is generously funded through the Community Foundation of Mahoning Valley and through Ohio Humanities, and we could not do this without their support.
So thank you.
Yeah, so today we are not going to do a long introduction to Kenneth Patchen, our topic today, and instead we are going to take hopefully a page out of his book and read a poem that he wrote to commemorate him and honor him, and then we're just going to jump right into our guest. Our guest, yes.
This is a poem by Kenneth Patchen entitled The Orange Bears. The orange bears with soft, friendly eyes who played with me when I was 10. Christ, before I left home, they'd had their paws smashed in the rolls, their backs seared by hot slag, their soft, thrusting bellies kicked in, their tongues ripped out, and I went down through the woods to the smelly crick with Whitman in the Haldeman Julius edition, and I just sat there worrying my thumbnail into the cover. What did we know about orange bears with their coats all stunk up with soft coal, and the National Guard coming over from Wheeling to stand in front of the mill gates with drawn bayonets jeering at the strikers? I remember you would put daisies on the windowsill at night, and in the morning they'd be so covered with soot you couldn't tell what they were anymore. A hell of a fat chance my orange bears had.
Our guest today is William Bill Mullane. Bill is an artist, an educator, an administrator, and civic leader whose collaboration and creative leadership has shaped a myriad of arts and cultural organizations and initiatives throughout the whole Mahoning Valley. He is a champion for the arts, for community, and the inseverable connection between the two. He currently serves on the boards of the Trumbull Art Gallery, of Southside Academy, and the Warren Philharmonic Orchestra, where he currently serves as the board president. In the 1980s, Bill's cross-organizational synergetic efforts resulted in the expansion of the Trumbull Art Gallery to incorporate creative programming, regular exhibitions, and the Kenneth Patchen Literary Festival, a multi-year project celebrating the life of Ohio poet Kenneth Patchen. His involvement in the visual arts has been featured by his work at the Butler Institute of American Art, where he has co-curated several exhibitions, including multiple Northeast Ohio scholastic art exhibitions and ceremonies. In the field of education, Bill has been an art educator, teacher of at-risk students, principal, and central office administrator. He spent his first 28 years in the Warren City Schools, where he culminated with serving as the principal of Warren G. Harding School for 10 years. He has been a supervisor of school improvement in Ashtabula County for the past 17 years. Next year will be his 45th year as a public school educator. We are here today with Bill Mullane.
Hi, Bill.
Hello. Glad to be here.
Thank you for coming.
Oh, anytime.
We're very excited to talk about Kenneth Patchen. I don't think that enough people locally know about him.
Yeah, I would say that's true. And I would also say he has particular relevance to this region. And so aside from being one of the major 20th century poets that came from here, exploring Kenneth Patchen allows us to explore our own history and the history of this region in really interesting ways. I mean, from the standpoint of class, industry, what education was in the 1920s, the significant amount of classmates who also went forward in these various areas, including literature, was really fascinating. And the teachers who taught them and who influenced them comes through very clearly.
So if I'm remembering this correctly, he was born in Niles?
Right, he was born in Niles back in 1911. His family were here for quite a number of years. I mean, they had immigrated long before Kenneth, but his father was a steel worker, worked as a roller in the mills, which was a relatively sophisticated job in the mill. And he also, on the side, did construction and built houses. Kenneth had 3 sisters and a brother, so they just around his early elementary years moved to Warren, and then he went to Willard, to East, and then to Warren G. Harding High School, where he graduated in 29. And, again, when you look at Kenneth's early life, his family kind of is real informative of what just was happening at that particular period of time in history. So his oldest sister, Eunice, died, I think, at the age of 9 in the flu epidemic of 1913. Reference COVID, but no. So that was a significant event, and another significant event, and one that impacted him a lot and found its way into his literature. He was very, very close to his younger sister, Kathleen, who, after leaving communion practice at St. Mary's Church, walked out in the street, was hit by a milk truck, and killed.
Oh, wow.
And so those 2 deaths were very impactful. And then his brother Hugh stayed in the region his whole life and eventually was Warren's fire chief. And then he had 2 sisters who lived here their whole lives. Again, very interesting when you start looking at someone's, when you investigate them in a time and a place, it becomes real informative of what families here were going through and what this region was about in terms of work, class, how they worked through the community. And then again, as I said, for me as an educator, when I started working with Kenneth Patchen, I was teaching at the time at Harding High School, and it was particularly relevant for my students because here was somebody who was sitting in the exact same desks that they were sitting in, which is very interesting. And of course, he started at Harding High School in 1926, the year it opens, and eventually, within my career, that school that opened in 1926 is now gone and been replaced by yet another school.
Sure.
So I think all of those things tie right into just how impactful Kenneth can be to young people here who can see sometimes themselves. And by studying Kenneth, you can see somebody who, sitting in that desk at Harding High School, could no way know where he would be or how he would be viewed in 1972, all those years later. And so that's a real, I think, instructive piece for students.
Do you have any sense of do you think his education in Warren impacted him long term? Do you have a sense of that?
There's absolutely no question. We were able to document that quite significantly. Janet Risden, the English teacher, who also allowed he and a group of classmates to have a literary society, was very, very impactful. Eventually, she introduced Kenneth and Walter Benton. His name was Walter Potashnik when he went to school here. He wrote under the name Walter Benton. So his classmate, another classmate at school, actually had 2 books of poetry, which at the time were the biggest selling books of poetry in the United States.
Wow.
And Walter Benton went on to be pretty successful himself. But the 2 of them were introduced to Louise Finney, who is Warren's premier music teacher, piano teacher in the city of Warren. She was also kind of a philanthropist, and she took the 2 of them in New York City so they could see that there was a world larger than Warren when they were juniors in high school. And that trip certainly impacted them. And both of them then ended up going to New York and beginning their careers there. So I think there was no question. There was another thing that was very interesting about education in the early 1920s. It certainly wasn't as broad as education is today, but the depth was certainly as great or greater than it ever is. And they were extremely focused on literacy. And there were lots of opportunities in the Warren schools in the 1920s to do much beyond the classroom, not only athletically and musically as it is today, but literarily, artistically, scientifically. It was a pretty progressive school system in a progressive era where education was truly valued. So I think those things came across really clearly. And in some of the letters, Helen Ridgely, who began her teaching career at East Junior, I think in 1926, moves to Harding, as a high school teacher. She stays at Harding until 1962. But when I met her and worked with her, she was in her mid-90s. And she had a lot of insight into how students were educated, and because she was the senior class advisor and worked closely with Kenneth and corresponded with him after he graduated, there no question that the teachers there were very influential.
I wanted to back up, if I could, to talking about his parents and their influence on his life, especially the fact that his father worked at a steel mill and how that impacted his poetic oeuvre.
Yeah, Kenneth is known as a working man's poet. I mean, he was definitely, his proletarian roots are deep. He was very much, in his writings, his poems, Orange Bears, Mr. Youngstown's Sheet and Tube, his letter to God, are all rooted here in the Valley and in steel. So his junior year, he got to go with his older brother Hugh and his father and work in the mill in the summer. I think that cemented for him forever the fact that that's not what he was going to do. But also, there was a certain brutality to working in the mills at that particular time. And it was a time of labor becoming of its own. And so the steel strikes were very impactful. He writes about them. But, for anybody who lived here, they understood, literally, people now don't really perhaps reflect on it, but they could be quite violent. I mean, we had National Guard versus steel worker versus scab in the Valley. And so that informed all of their lives. So that was important. And his father was a really hardworking man, pretty rigid in his outlook. Something that, I think influenced Kenneth also. He and his mother tended to be at odds sometimes, only because Kenneth could be so strident. And, there's reports, I remember his sister saying, because Kenneth is known ultimately as a pacifist, but in his personal demeanor, he could be pretty angry. As a 16 or 17-year-old, I guess, one day, Majel told me that his mom and he had some disagreement, and he picked up the coffee pot and threw it out the back door. So he could be.
That's not dissimilar to any 16, 17-year-old, I guess. Yeah.
So he had those contrarian kinds of attitudes when he was young. He could be pretty sullen, and was throughout his life. And it's always been interesting too, because in high school, he was on track. He was in drama. He played in the orchestra. He played in a marching band. He was senior class president. He was yearbook staff. It seemed like he joined much. Was co-founder of this literary group at the high school. And yet, after high school, post-high school, he really became against joining anything, to the detriment of his career. Did not want to be, when Life magazine was doing their famous issue on the Beat poets, they went right to him, considering him to be a beat, and he kind of said, "No, you can't include me because I'm not part of that." Though he was very influential in all of those movements, he pretty much refused to allow himself to be branded by others. So it was an interesting contrast, his home life, his school life, and then how it manifests itself over the next 40 or so years.
Can I follow that up with another question about sort of his younger days? So after he graduates from Warren G. Harding, he goes on and sounds like he travels a bit throughout the country. Talk about that influence, how that happens.
Yeah. So in high school, he worked very hard. At the time, the equivalent of A and A plus is E and E plus, and that's pretty much where he fell in his academic grades and things. And he worked to get a small scholarship. But again, unlike so many of his peers who went to traditional post-secondary institutions, if that's where they were going to college or university, he went to the Meiklejohn Experimental College out in Wisconsin. And he gets there. And experimental in that Meiklejohn as an educator was much more open. It was an open curriculum and very fluid in its development. And he only lasts there for a year, and he grows kind of, I think, disinterested and disaffected. And then he does some traveling across the country from Wisconsin back to New York. And the rest of his life is spent really moving about for the early years until he and his wife Miriam settle in Palo Alto in California, where they remained the last 30 years of their life. But he had a lot of those experiences. And Kenneth, as a purveyor of and really one of the inventors of the jazz and poetry movement, would tour quite a bit. So, there's ample documentation of him. In fact, recorded, there are a couple albums that came out of him reading to jazz with, but he with significant jazz players. So, I remember seeing a photograph of him sitting with Allen Ginsberg outside the studio prior to going in and performing with Charles Mingus.
Oh, wow.
So, he was really part of that movement. And of course, really in the tradition of William Blake, who, he admired as a young person, he really became known for combining visual imagery with poetry. And his painted poems and silk screens become really part of his entire legacy.
Before we dive more into his career, you mentioned his wife Miriam. It seemed that she was had a huge impact on his life. Can you talk a little bit about her?
Yeah, Miriam was, he and Miriam met, fell in love, got married, but theirs was a life of poverty for the most part. And just for a moment, go back a little bit. One of the most interesting things about working with the class of 1929, and one of the reasons in 87 and 89 when we were doing the Patchen Festival that it was important to do it at that particular time, is the class of 29 wasn't going to be with us all that much longer. Many of them were gone. But it was interesting two ways. One, the class of 29 was typical of school here. Many of the classmates left school by 10th grade. Many women went back to, young women went back to work, on the farm or in their families or were starting families themselves. And if you were going to industry, you could leave at 10th grade. It always struck me, though, that when they did leave at that time, they still stayed part of their class in terms of class reunions and thinking of each other as classmates. And more importantly, they were extremely literate, even with a 10th grade education. It was amazing working with that class, a class that still wrote longhand and communicated by letters. It was very interesting. The other piece for them was the class of 29, they're the June class of 29. And when you think about that, you're graduating in June of 29 in what is a very prosperous and pretty rock and roll time for the United States. And in 3-4 months, October comes and now you're in the middle of the Depression. And so, this is a class that, all of that optimism and leaving school in June, a lot of plans just simply were upended by the advent of the Depression and the sudden economic realities that impacted people, especially working class people. So that class had a lot to think about and a lot to really communicate. The other piece is, their children their young lives are informed by World War I, and they're not too many years later of World War II. So this is a generation that really and truly went from, by the time I meet them in 1987, they've been through World War I, the Depression, World War II, the Korean War, and are now, on the other side of the Vietnam War. So their lives were kind of informed by that very exciting time. And they also were the first generation to really experience born in 1911, their parents, certainly born in the late 1800s, had no technology. And by the time they're aged, they're surrounded by technology. So this is a class and a group of people who really lived very interesting and kind of rich lives and relied on each other quite a bit. And I think one of the reasons at least I could surmise that the number of the class of 29 stayed so close together was, again, because they entered a time of uncertainty. Even though they just left high school, that was their support group. But anyway, Miriam and he were extremely close, and she spent her life really in support of his art. She was his muse. She protected him and really and truly was the person who a lot of times was the one going out and working, and bringing home, money and paying the rent and doing other things. She was really a great sounding board for him. And after his death in 1972, I think his whole legacy was kept alive by her, and her just being relentless in spreading the word and making sure that his archives and all of his work was preserved. She finally put the archives at the University of California at Santa Cruz. So she really was, I think anything having to do with Kenneth from their marriage on, it was definitely a partnership. And he had lots of bouts of health. He had some back issues. He was separating the bumper of two cars and injured his back. And then later on, on his way to back surgery, they actually dropped him off the gurney, injured him even further. He was bedridden for quite a long time.
That's terrifying.
And so towards at the end of his life, the painted poems, a lot of that work was a result of his immobility and something that he could do from the bed or sitting, because he became somewhat immobile. But she was a remarkable woman. And herself a committed pacifist, and she was very involved in all the movements of the time. Labor, for sure, anti-war, ecology were all things that were dear to her heart. And she knew everyone. That was the other thing. That I think that, one of the things that always strikes me about these guys together is that they go through their life and not recognizing that the people that they're interacting with will someday be literary heroes. Mm-hmm. But in real time, when they lived in the village, they're with E. Cummings and his wife, Henry Miller, they're, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, Byrne Porter. All these folks, New Directions books, they worked at. So they knew lots and lots of people. Mm-hmm. And you couldn't go out with Miriam in other places without running into some really interesting people.
Did you want to dig into his career a bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So can we start by just broad strokes overview? Why should people know Kenneth Patchen?
Well, I think, again, when you get beyond this region, you want to know Kenneth Patchen for the impact he had on literature and performance literature in America. So there's no doubt that the jazz and poetry movement leads to a lot of other things. His ability to combine his poetry with images is a whole other area. And then just the significance of his work, especially as it relates to labor, pacifism, anti-war literature. He falls in all of those categories and has an important insight into how the things that are going on in the country at the time, he had a real keen sense of being able to take what was going on and translate it through his poetry and his prose in a way that I think draws into today. What I found in all my work with Kenneth Patchen was young people are still really drawn to him because there's an optimism. And you look at his work on the surface and you think this is not optimistic work, but there is an optimism, and I think that optimism is that you can change things. It's a call to arms. So in that sense, he's important. And then again, if you want to if your interest is literature, poetry, you really can use Kenneth, as I say, as a springboard to find the other writers. This area was rich. Hart Crane was here. And of course, Hart Crane was very influential of Kenneth. So we have, you have an area, Warren, industrial, steel making, what we're known for, and yet lots of literary folk, come from here and move on in a variety of areas. And that's interesting too, to see, how this environment, and I think, it's relevant to kind of how this area had viewed itself post-steel. The whole Rust Belt concept and the whole idea of what we were. You look back and you say, that's what we were then. Here we were, this industrial valley, certainly a class division between, the Mahoning Avenue and Niles Avenue, or the Flats. There was that real distinction. And yet, out of that period of time and out of those distinctions rose a lot of people who went other directions and were very influential, not only in literature but in politics, and influential, certainly the union movement here. And so I think it's really good to reflect on and to understand the impact your environment can have on you, but also the impact that you can have on your environment. And I think you learn that through Kenneth, and you can learn that through Walter Benton, and you can learn that through Hart Crane, and you can learn that by just really spending time looking at the steel movement here, looking at the advent of unions and the demise of unions, and looking at that cycle.
So do you remember the first time you were introduced to Kenneth Patchen? Like what hooked you?
I was introduced to Kenneth Patchen serendipitously when I was about 15. I was 15, 16 years old. I started to go to bookstores up around Coventry. I was living here, but I was originally from New York City, so I'd get back to New York where I had family quite frequently in the summers and things, and there I would go to Gotham Books and other places. I was kind of a strange 16-year-old, I guess, but I enjoyed literature. So I was just kind of going through the stacks and kind of taking a look at all the different things that were out there. I was attracted to the Beat movement. I knew Ginsberg, I knew Ferlinghetti. When we were in school and everybody in class was sitting at their desk reading Willa Cather, I had my Patchen or Ferlinghetti inside the book. I couldn't take, my Antonia at the time. So my Antonia, I just couldn't do it. So I was always kind of fascinated. But at that particular point, I just knew Patchen as a writer. It was probably when I was 17 or 18 that I realized he was from here. And then I didn't give it much thought for a number of years, but when I began teaching at Harding High School, it struck me he was from here. He must have gone to school here. And that's when I started to introduce his work to students, but also have my yearbook staff start doing some research. And of course, we were a good place to get to find out about his early life, because we had the archives of all the school newspapers, all the school yearbooks, access to things like report cards from the 1920s, and that was kind of a gap in people's study of Patchen, was understanding him here. And because he still had family alive when we started doing the work, and then Larry Smith, who is Patchen's biographer, and Tom Koba, a documentary filmmaker, were beginning thinking about doing the Patchen film that they eventually did. We decided to collaborate with them and produce it, but also we shot it all here. So we were at the high school, we were and then through that met his sister and uncovered then troves of family photos and other things that kind of informed that early life. And in the first person, because you could do it with the people who knew him.
Yeah.
And it was the last opportunity. As I say, Helen was in her mid-90s by the time we were working with her, so Helen Ridgely. So there wasn't a lot of time left to have first-person accounts of his youth.
You mentioned earlier William Blake. Is Blake an influence, or is it just a coincidence that they share similar...
No, he was definitely an influence. I mean, Kenneth cited him as an early influence, and one of his classmates, Isabel Smith, who may have kind of been his first love interest in high school in an innocent kind of way, but even recounted the fact that when they were doing their literary society, literary club, Blake was one of the people that Kenneth brought up. So he was definitely an influence, and Kenneth knew him very young. And certainly when you look at his painted poems, you can see how Blakean, the Blakean influence for sure.
Was there a tie to the Romantic?
I think so, as well? Yeah, definitely. They were, as young people, they were really amazingly wide-read, and so they were definitely familiar with. But I think the Romantics certainly had, an early influence. And moving forward, then, again, a very exciting time in literature. Kenneth grew up as a poet and as a writer in a time that was really fluid and really just moving at rapid, it really in all the arts. This was the time of movements. You think, again, this was a generation of people who in their short lives experienced, American realism, social realism, abstract expressionism, which influenced how performing with jazz. They lived through the early pop art movements, and so it was just a raucous time in history. And anybody who was emerging as an artist or writer had so much rich surroundings, and communication had, post-Depression on, communications become so much more fluid. Not like today with our technology, but certainly as radio, TV, and other things came, it was a lot easier to be influenced by things far away, which prior to, really, when you think of the class of 1911, did not have that luxury when he was a child. So these are all things that were very influential.
I had another career question. So you talked about Charles Mingus. There's a note that he has some musical collaborations. Interesting to me is John Cage. Can you talk a little bit about his musical collaborations, maybe specifically with John Cage? And
yeah, well, it was interesting. So Patchen wrote 2 plays, Don't Look Now and A City Wears a Slouch Hat. And City Wears a Slouch Hat was a radio play. And it just happened that on CBS at the time, there was a radio program that did reenactments of play, and Cage chose to do that play, and so that's their interaction. So they I don't think had a lot of connection with each other outside of that,
okay. But
it was Cage who produced and did the recording. Subsequently, we did the second production of City Wears a Slouch Hat, and the only second time that Don't Look Now was produced on stage live. And we did that too at Kent State Theater. So we were able to do both plays, which was fascinating. But yeah, like John Cage, it's always interesting, I think, when you suddenly realize so many people reference Patchen, Cage being one of them, Henry Miller, being another. Certainly, Cummings was very much aware of him, and Lawrence Ferlinghetti, who wrote his elegy quite brilliantly, was another. Richard Brodigan, certainly knew Patchen and Patchen's work, and it goes on. And then, of course, like I say, Miriam came into her own after Kenneth's death and took his work in a lot of arenas and things. But I remember I was at the Naropa Institute, the Jack Kerouac School for Disembodied Poetics in Denver, at a piece on Patchen. I'm sitting with Miriam, and here comes David Dillinger from the Chicago 8, and he's like, "Hey, Miriam," and they go back forever. They sat in together. They did all kinds of things in the past, and I got to sit in a little diner and watch diabetic Miriam and David eat like tons of ice cream and do everything they're not supposed to do at their old age, but but she just knew everybody. It was really amazing to just realize the scope of the people that they knew and the people that they considered contemporaries and friends. We then consider like really important people in literature, the arts, and politics, but to them they were just chums.
I have a personal question for you, Bill. And this is getting a little off topic, but just roll with me here. So you're from New York City. You were born in New York City.
Born in Brooklyn. Mm-hmm. Lived there until I was in 3rd grade. Mm-hmm. Then we moved.
I honestly can't tell. No, I'm completely kidding.
Yeah, so we moved here when I was in 3rd grade, and but I always had family there, so I kept to keep that connection.
Sure.
Yeah. And now you work up in Ashtabula.
Right.
What is it about this area that inspires you?
Well, this area, I've always found this region to be of particular interest, I guess because I was here and grew up here. I'm not sure that had I remained in New York, this would have ever occurred to me, but once I was here, it did. I think there are certain things, first of all, about being in an area like this that have, cities, Ashtabula City, Youngstown City, Warren as a city. It was always interesting that even though they were cities, they weren't cities like big cities. It was easy to have influence here. much more difficult in larger places that are more complex. It struck me even at the age of 18, or, I'm 26, 27, we're doing the Patchen Festival. Even at that time, I could walk into any bank president's office and get a check. I could walk into the publisher at a newspaper's office and hang out and get a check. You could go into a mayor's office or city council and say, we want to do this, and get them to sign whatever paper needed to be signed. So that struck me. The ability to get things done was certainly easier at a level in a region like this than larger regions. But I think the thing that's most optimistic here is this is a place that has a history of many periods in history of oppression, but it also has many periods in its history of moving forward. Mm-hmm. And it was an optimistic area overall. I was always appreciative of the fact that the labor movement in many ways started here and was most relevant here. I was very impressed, I've always been impressed with Warren City's educational system, very progressive for the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. Certainly, we may not today, we look back and certainly can see lots of issues and problems around race and class, but for the time and in the context, it was a very progressive system. Progressive system of libraries. McKinley Memorial Library, very influential to Kenneth as a young person. Those public resources were here and stayed here. And as I worked for the state of Ohio and did things over the last 30 years with the Ohio Arts Council and visited communities throughout Ohio evaluating grants, that didn't happen everywhere. Many of the cities, the Rust Belt cities of the time, the mills closed, industry changed, and they lost their resources. They lost their history societies, their arts infrastructure. We certainly took a hit, but we didn't lose it. Mm-hmm. And so those things are very optimistic. And there's always been, there's a sense of history here that's pretty impressive. From our cemeteries to our monuments to how we looked at neighborhoods, and pretty progressive today in terms of how we've tackled problems. I would say that in Youngstown Neighborhood Development Corporation, Trumbull Neighborhood Partnership here in Trumbull County are unique ways of interacting with economic development. Models, if you will, for a nation that was behind. It was this region that could convince the federal government after many years that taking down property was a legitimate way of addressing economic blight and issues that was alien to them, because in terms of New York and San Francisco, the bi-coastal kinds of things, taking down property is gentrification. And here it was a necessity. 65,000 to 40,000 people, you have too many buildings. So those kinds of strategies could emerge here and really influence a nation, whereas anywhere else, that is a lot harder mountain to climb. So that inspires me.
Yeah.
A special shout out to Carrie Kibbe there from the McKinley Memorial Library, the director. I'm sure she'll appreciate that. Yeah.
A very influential place, and influential too. And then our library, which was a Carnegie library, was So there's a lot to be said here. So growing, being here in this region, there's always a tinge of optimism.
Yeah, I agree.
I do. I think that's why.
Yeah, that's why we're all here.
Are you right?
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Bill. This has been a very enlightening conversation.
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
it was great.
Anytime.
Yeah.
Love to talk.
So for our object highlight this week, we are going to focus on a booklet that was given to us by Bill Mullane, our guest this week, who, while he was at the Trumbull Art Gallery, published a booklet on Kenneth Patchen, a variety of his poems, but also poems that were written in memory of Kenneth Patchen. So to close up this week's episode, I'm going to read a poem written by Lawrence Ferlinghetti called An Elegy on the Death of Kenneth Patchen. And it is a long poem. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm just going to read the last couple of stanzas. He is gone he is scattered under sea, and knows what time, but won't be back to tell it. He He would be too proud to call back anyway, and too full of strange laughter to speak to us anymore anyway. And the weight of human experience lies upon the world, like the chains of the sea in which he sings. And he swings in the tides of the sea, and his ashes are washed in the ides of the sea. And an astonished eye looks out of the air to see the poet singing there. And dusk falls down a coast somewhere, where a white horse without a rider turns its head to the sea.
I think that's all for this episode. Till next time.